represented here from Pittsburgh. A group that has tripled in size to over 600 members. I guess not all 600 come to your meetings, right? Yeah, okay. And she has professional experience in clinical and research psychology, an MS in professional counseling, and bachelor's degrees in psychology, anthropology, and French. She has specializations in trauma psychology as applies to grief and sexual assault, motivational interviewing, and humanistic approaches to counseling. Thank you.
It always makes me crack up when people introduce me. All right. I can't see. Is that on there? Okay. All right. I'm going to adjust this a little bit too. What a great talk that was by Justin, by the way. Justin, where is he? I have to thank you for that because it was a great segue to what I'm going to talk about. There were some fantastic examples of in-group, out-group bias and other lovely cognitive biases that happen when we engage in conflict in the world. So that's going to be a really nice segue. So I'm very excited to be here, and the reason, especially on a Sunday afternoon when the serious people are left who are sticking it out here till the end, right, is that I feel like there's a time in this movement where we're still at a time in this movement when the persistent people are showing up, right? There's a time in the beginning of every movement where it's the people who feel like they have to be there, and that's sort of a filter. So not only am I here at this time in the movement, but I'm here at this time in the afternoon at the end of the conference when all of you persistent folks are still here. That makes me very happy. But being that we might be an outspoken group of people, we do have a problem. And our problem is that we have to convince people who think we're no better than rapists, people who have a deep moral distrust in us, that we're just like them. We have to convince people we're good without God, and right now that is definitely not the stereotype. And that makes sense because people like Bill O'Reilly are comparing us to Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot on Fox News. That was only in 2011. So what's always stood out to me is that it's often the people who know us best. Our families, our friends, our coworkers, the people who've known us for years. These are the people who need the most convincing. And that's why we call it coming out, right? It's coming out into a hostile environment. It doesn't make sense, at least it doesn't make sense to me, that people who know us best would still be able to think such horrible things about us. And you would think that our family and friends would be able to put aside whatever perception comes with the label atheist and assign a little bit more weight to what they already know about us. But that is not how the human brain works. Not at all. And that's what we're up against, and that's what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about the stigma, why it exists, and how we can convince the people we meet on a daily basis of what we already know. That we're people, we're good people, we're not criminals, we're not hedonists, necessarily. And we're not what they fear they would become without religion. Which is, I imagine, something like Apocalypse Now or the Jersey Shore, or as my husband put it last night when I was trying to think of an analogy, something like Charlie Sheen with diplomatic immunity. And the reality is, though we are a growing minority, we are still a minority. And you might be the only example of a non-believer that someone encounters. So it really is up to us to make the best impression we can everywhere we go. Personal one-to-one interactions really are the meat of this movement. At least I feel that way. I know from personal experience, because my mom still asks me after all these years of knowing I'm an atheist, or at least an agnostic. And keep in mind, she did raise me. She still asks me how atheists can know right from wrong. And I have to admit, this is probably my fault, because it did take me a while to figure out that jumping into a full-scale explanation of how moral instincts evolved when she was still skeptical about evolution, probably not a good idea. But at least she's skeptical about something. So, moving along, this is what people think of us. They don't trust us. You have probably seen this study. This is an article reporting on the study that came out a while back, I believe in the end of 2011, but this article is from 2012. The headline is, "Are Atheists Worse Than Rapists?" People really do believe that fear of God is what keeps us all in line, and without it, there's nothing to stop us from doing whatever we want. Never mind that whatever we want generally turns out to mean sitting around watching debates on YouTube and complaining politely about things, and we don't feel guilty about that. So, I didn't have to go far to find this. I Googled three fingers are. I love to do this. Have you ever done this on Google? You just type something in and see what comes up to follow the words. I Googled free thinkers are, and this is, this is what came up. Satan's slaves, dangerous, dangerous. And then I Googled atheists are. And these are the searches related to atheists are. Wrong, annoying, smarter, idiots, should die. This is what people think of us. They think we're Muslim too, apparently, that last one. They're all atheists are Muslim. Herb Silverman yesterday, when he said one nation undereducated, I couldn't help myself. I can't decide whether I want to say under Canada or undereducated from now on when I say the pledge. So now we're going to talk about, oh, and by the way, in case we get too self-righteous, here's what we think about Christians, at least what Google thinks we think about Christians, right? So we are all guilty of this. We all have brains, unfortunately. So we're going to talk about some of the reasons why this stigma exists now. What is going on in our brains that leads to all this hate and misunderstanding? First of all, you might have noticed we're not all that intelligently designed. For time's sake, I've picked a couple of examples from a list of cognitive processes that can really lead us into trouble. All of the processes I'm about to mention evolved, of course, to help us preserve mental resources. The brain is metabolically expensive as an organ. But as much as we love evolution, it does not care about us. There are plenty of cases where evolutionary pressure favors speed over accuracy when it comes to the brain. And even within the brain, different regions are in constant competition with one another for resources. So this leads to a lot of problems that you will maybe find yourself familiar with. My favorite time in resource saver is the stereotype. Stereotypes help us categorize and make sense of the world with the least amount of cognitive effort possible. So once something's categorized, it's easier to identify, to remember, and most importantly, you can use it to make predictions about the future. If I tell you you're about to meet my Christian brother, my hypothetical Christian brother, because I don't have one, you have already begun to imagine what he might look like. Right now you're imagining what he might say or think, and based on your life experience with Christians, you have a visualization you can use to make an assumption about what he might be like, what he might do, and how he might react. And the more certain we feel about things, the more rewarding that is to our brain. So we like to predict things. We like to daydream and imagine how things are going to end up. I'm hoping I don't have to explain what happens when we make too many assumptions. But here's something else that can go wrong. Impressions. Research shows that once we make an initial evaluation of a person, we look, or even an object, we look for things to back that impression up. So we look for evidence to reinforce our first impression, and this is why con artists, for example, who make a really charming first impression can really get away with a lot more. It's a lot harder for people to believe that they're a criminal later on. It's why it's so hard for us to convince believers that we're not spending all our time defacing currency. You know who you are. And another barrier to reducing stigma is outgroup bias. And this is something that Justin gave a great example of in his speech. Our brains love to divide the world into groups. into in-groups and out-groups, and the definitions are totally subjective and they can switch up on you depending on what frame of reference you have. So friend or stranger, pedestrian, motorist, people who like peanut butter, people who don't like peanut butter. I guarantee some of you are having an emotional reaction thinking, I love peanut butter, or I hate peanut butter as I'm saying that. So not only can you look around right now instantly in this room and know whether each person is in your in-group or out-group, the extent to which you feel positive or negative about them is wholly dependent on it. Well, I don't want to say wholly, but very much dependent on it. We pay more attention to what people in our in-groups say. And we're very quick to experience more negative feelings about people who are in our out-groups. People who read the Bible, people who don't. One of those will make you feel more comfortable. So going further, we're more capable of recognizing subtle differences in our in-groups. And my favorite example of this from recently is Romney's recent 47% comment. After he, I skipped ahead, didn't I? After he painted 47% of the people who don't pay income tax as dependent and entitled Obama voters, people spent many days highlighting the overlooked diversity of that group, and that's an example of in-group, out-group bias. He skipped over the diversity of the out-group for him. And to be fair, if you read liberal blogs, you will find blanket, unrealistically negative statements being made about Romney voters as well, that they're bigots, that they're all voting against their own interests. These are not necessarily taking into account the diversity of these groups, right? And so now that I've politicized things, we can talk a little about emotions and where they come in. First, you'll need to know a bit about two regions of the brain that are fairly at odds with one another. The prefrontal cortex, which is up here on the left-hand side, it's in the front of the brain if you're facing forward, and the limbic system, which, if you can see this box that I've drawn, is a huge chunk of many regions in the center of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is our executive function. It helps us plan and decide what actions best meet our needs, and it's responsible for social inhibition, personality, and processing new information. It's the part that says you could have garlic bread tonight, but you also don't want to sit alone in the corner. The limbic system, which is pretty much everything in that box, is responsible for emotions and the formation of memory. It reminds you that you love garlic bread, and you were really embarrassed, too, the last time you ate it and no one sat next to you. So the important point about these two areas is activation of one region generally results in deactivation or inhibition of the other. So they have an inverse relationship. This is because in situations with low or moderate stress, the prefrontal cortex inhibits the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for emotions that relate to the 4 F's: fight, flight, feeding, and mating. So I'm not going to say the 4th F. So it makes us feel things like fear, reward, and anger that normally the prefrontal cortex can respond to with a spot of reason and inhibition. In a normal low-stress situation, you want the garlic bread or the cookie, for example, but you can decide whether or not to eat it because your prefrontal cortex is still engaged. And as your stress level may increase, it gets harder to make those choices. Your rational thought capacity is there less and less and less to police your emotions when stress increases. And this is where things can get ugly. If something extremely stressful happens that lights up the amygdala, it has the power to shut down the prefrontal cortex completely. It has this fight or flight or freeze response that you may have heard of, and it's instantaneous. It's something that evolved for situations in which there's no time for decision making. You can't think about whether you want garlic bread. You have to drop it and run when you're confronted with a tiger. And that's incidentally why people don't eat when they're stressed, and a lot of other things that happen to our body as part of the stress response. So there are times, high stress times, when executive decision-making processes go completely down to the count and our emotions take over. By threatening somebody, whether it's real or perceived, you can completely disable their ability to think straight. And this isn't all or nothing, it's on a continuum. A threat could be anything that causes stress, from the tiger to just an uncomfortable thought. The level of stress will influence the amount of rational thought versus emotion that's available, and is totally subjective to the perceived experience of stress. And adding to that, increased stress and emotion can influence memory. More emotion leads to stronger memories. And those memories last longer, especially if it's a negative emotion. We all remember where we were the morning of 9/11. Last Tuesday, not so much. And it makes sense that our brains do this because emotions like fear and anger are often about events we really want to be prepared for in case they happen again. So at this point, you've probably figured out that if your goal is to get someone to process new information and think critically about stereotypes like atheists are criminals or they should die, the absolute last thing we want is for them to feel threatened or attacked. The worst part about this is if you combine the process I just described with the sort of negative emotional response triggered by stereotypes and other biases, you can see that someone, if they're at all stressed by their perception of you, you've lost them. They're not going to be able to listen. And you've additionally probably just given them a fun, new, bad memory to hang on to. And that's notwithstanding some aspects of religion that do help us regulate our emotions. So, for example, relief from the fear of death. When my mother asked me, what do you think happens when we die? And I answered, we get eaten by worms? She was really horrified and she changed the subject. And it's an example of how that can be overwhelming and frightening for some people to imagine. I didn't really even engage her in conflict there. I just did something that scared her and shut down her brain. So this leads me to a couple of important points, and now we're on the right slide. First, as fun as some of you may think it is to attack and argue or ridicule people, just be aware that that will legitimately slam the door to rational understanding of any point you have. And if you can't call the discussion you're having calm and rational, you are in serious danger of indulging your own emotional satisfaction to the point where you're reinforcing someone's distrust in all of us. And starting with the premise that someone needs to change, or the inherent assumption that I know more than you, will definitely create a strong threat response and pushback as well. Something we all inherently know, but we do it anyway. Second, if you want to reduce stigma, it's essential to reduce limbic system activation as much as possible whenever you're talking to somebody. Any kind of threat, real or perceived, in the current moment, or even just something they remember, something bad that they remember about the stigma that's on the person they're talking with, can shut down their ability to take in new information and shuts down the possibility for change. So fear is really the enemy of trust in this case, and it's mistrust that the studies have found people have for atheists. Third, if you want to change someone's opinion of you, making conversation rewarding for them will definitely increase the likelihood that will happen. The less stressed they are, the more their brain will perceive and process the new good information. Fourth, I haven't even begun to scratch the surface here with applicable brain science, but consider that emotions are highly contagious. And unfortunately, negative emotions are more contagious than positive ones. So your stress will definitely spread throughout a room. And it also doesn't work to hide your stress from people because it actually makes their blood pressure go up when you try. So don't try to change people's thinking about you if you're stressed or in a bad mood. Just wait until you can be calm and pleasant so it can be rewarding for everybody. I don't know if everybody can read this, but basically it's an engineering joke about not having any people skills on the comment up here. All my friends are engineers, so we think it's funny. If you're anything like me, you're sitting here wondering at this point, what are we supposed to do with this mess of a no-win situation that the brain is putting us in with stigma? But I can tell you, because actually my expertise is in counseling, and this is the meat of what I do. There are plenty of things we can do on a personal level to reduce the effects of these biases. And what Dilbert's recruit is recognizing is that it's called people skills. One thing to keep in mind before I start in, these aren't skills that you can perfect overnight. However, they are easy to grasp, and they're things that anybody can use. They just require a little bit of practice and effort and some self-awareness. And if you're frustrated, just take solace that many, many thousands of counseling students are bungling this stuff on a daily basis, and they are on video being shown to everybody until they get it right. So the other thing too is, if you want to feel better about struggling through this, remember that the brain area that's responsible for intelligence and problem solving is also at odds with the area that's responsible for social skills and empathy. So if you're practiced at one of those things, you're a lot less likely to be practiced at the other. And props to you if you can do both. So the first thing, we need to adjust and frame our perspective in a couple of ways when we're interacting with people. When we sit down with someone, we need to acknowledge that both parties are looking to get something satisfying out of the interaction. We're not there for blood and guts. Or maybe we are, but we might not benefit if we are. At the very least, everyone wants to come away feeling like they've been heard and respected, and not like their amygdala has been hijacked. So we do need to consider where someone's coming from, and if someone's spending an entire conversation with you feeling upset that they're not going in the same direction when you die, for example, you're not going to be addressing the real issue. You won't be meeting the person where they are. And we need to consider what we're asking people to give up in terms of what their perception is about us. Also, we need to adjust what we consider to be a victory. We all know that with what we know about the brain at this point, we could probably be satisfied if we managed just to keep a conversation rational when we step into a debate situation. That's a victory for me. We can call it a huge success if someone walks away simply feeling respected or thinking, hey, that person's not so bad. And we need to remember that no one's story this weekend sounded like, I became an atheist because I got into an argument with an atheist and decided he was right. Stigma changes very slowly over time, and so we have to be prepared to come to the table again and again and again with patience and willingness to meet someone where they are. And we have to reframe how we think about people. As a counselor, I depend on a humanistic perspective, and that means I do not consider myself an expert. Everyone's their own expert about who they are in their life. And every thought and adaptation is something that just helps us get through the day. So there's no good or bad, it's only what helps you survive. And if someone senses you're judging them, or that you think they're irrational, or that you think you know better, you have lost them. The best thing we can do is approach every conversation knowing we have these brains, knowing we all have these biases, and that it's biology, it's not personal. So some of the skills, again, I want to talk about reframing. A lot of what I just talked about is reframing. But it's a vital skill for regulating your emotions. You can practice reframing in an uncomfortable situation and instantly turn it less stressful and more rewarding. I'm standing up here now, and I could stand here and think, oh my God, there's a room of people staring at me, and if I mess up, it's all about a status threat. I could stand here and think that, and it would raise my blood pressure. But instead I choose to think, this is my opportunity to share my knowledge, and that makes me really happy. And my brain is tricked into not being emotional about things because of that reframe. So you want your limbic system to not be setting the reward. You want your prefrontal cortex to be activated when you're in a stressful situation. And you can play tricks on it with this reframing process. And there are some more skills as well that you can use to make sure people have good experience in talking with you. First, let the other person do most of the talking. I'm not trying to doom you to endless boring monologues from people you disagree with, but use open-ended questions like, what has your experience been? You can find out what people think and how they came to thinking it so that you know you're meeting them where they are. And rather than asking them a bunch of questions, you can throw some statements in that reflect that you understand what's going on. Like, I see how you think that. Statements that demonstrate that you can listen and empathize and care about their views. This is a little bit from motivational interviewing, and that's another one of my specialties. So stages of change. Try to gauge this. Try to gauge where people are when you're interacting with them. When it comes to making a change, probably in our case, people are either going to be pre-contemplative or contemplative. And the only way to move someone through these stages is to raise their awareness that the image of an atheist they have is not accurate. It's called creating a discrepancy, and it's showing someone that their present behavior or belief is inconsistent with their basic goals and values. So the best way to raise awareness, for example, about a discrepancy is to reflect it in a statement. You might say, so you believe people are inherently decent, but atheists are an exception. And you can see how that statement would elicit some reasoning. And one point about readiness to change, people like to resist change because it takes a lot of effort. So make sure you consider ahead of time what factors might be reducing someone's ability to listen. Say they're tired, they're stressed, that sort of thing. And final tips. Know your triggers. Know the times, places, people, the issues that stress you out, because if you bump into one of those things, it's going to reduce your ability to interact rationally with people. Focus on similarities. The more we focus on definitions and defining ourselves and separating ourselves from one another, the less we're able to talk about what we're for, what we stand for. And that's what's going to create in-group feelings with people. So we want to make sure that in creating in-group feelings, we talk about what we agree about a lot. Tell people your story, because that's the best way to illustrate that you have the values we're trying to say that we have. And there's some other neat things on there, like use I statements. Has anyone heard of an I statement? Is that very few people have heard of an I statement? Okay, it's basically using I to say how you feel. So instead of saying, you stole my lunch, you say, I'm really hungry and you just took my lunch, so I might have to get something else. It's a little less confrontational. And reward people when they understand you. Give them a reward for showing that they're listening to you. Say, I'm really glad that we had this talk. I'm really glad, it feels great to be understood. Something like that. And if everything else fails, just apologize, even if you're not wrong, because my favorite thing to do at work when people, there's a conflict coming up and we're not understanding each other is just to say, I'm sorry, I know sometimes I really don't explain things clearly, even though I feel like I've really clearly explained everything. And it's the most self-effacing thing you can do to put someone off on calm, get them off their edge. So anyway, these are my little ways of finding victory. Thank you for listening.
We have time for some questions. I'd like to take the first one myself since I'm already up here.
Sure.
I think many of us have seen this when we're talking to believers. If we start off too strong, we start to see the eyes glaze over, we start to see the walls going up, and at that point we're just talking past each other and not to each other. One of the things I've found helpful is instead of debating somebody, is asking them questions. And it seems to me that when I ask a question, it engages a different part of their mind. It makes them think about that answer they have to give. And the walls have to come down because they have to think to answer. Is there a neurological process that is behind that? Is there science behind that, or am I imagining this?
Oh no, you're right. There's science behind it. I mean, it's not the magical power of questions themselves, but one thing I sort of skipped over is open-ended questions, right? So there are different kinds of questions, and if I ask you, what the heck were you thinking? That still lights up your amygdala, right? But if I'm asking you an open-ended question that's eliciting information, it does engage the prefrontal cortex, and so you do want to preface your questions with, so what made you think that? Or how did you get to that place? Or tell me your story. Those are the sort of questions that engage rational thinking. You can craft any statement or question to engage rational.
So if somebody has already shut down, or you see them shutting down, can you open them back up with that?
Well, it depends on the person and how strong the stigma is probably, and how engaged they are in their stress response, and a lot of other factors like how used to being stressed they are. Because a lot of people will be sort of trauma bound and stress bound, and they're used to having a stress response. It's harder for them to manage, harder for them to pull out of that. So that's a huge factor in answering that question. But if you are talking to somebody who is not to the point where they're having a little mini panic attack, the best way to pull yourself out would be to reflect. So you would want to reflect probably the meaning and the content of what they're saying. Something like, for example, so I'm noticing that you sound a little stressed and you're not liking what I said. That's a reflection of probably wholesale what they're talking about at the point that they're that stressed. And that might make them stop and realize you understand them and you're less of a threat.
Okay. Does the whole idea of ego come into this sometimes too, that if you're asking them about themselves, talking about them instead of the problem? I know a lot of people like to talk about themselves. Can that also bring somebody out of that state? Or once they're in that riled up state, that it's kind of reflected and back off a little?
I don't know how related those two things are, so I would say that I think as a rule people enjoy talking about themselves because they're their own experts. So that's a surefire way of putting somebody at ease, generally speaking. However, again, if you phrase something where you're asking something about somebody's beliefs and you phrase it in a way that might be disrespectful, there's, even though you're asking about them, you're still triggering their stress. How can you believe that? It's still a question about somebody, but it's not quite eliciting in a respectful way.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering at what stage you are with your mother, like your understanding with her, because I'm going through the same thing and I'm not having any luck, and I feel like this is going to help me quite a bit.
Okay, all right. That's a great question because in the past week, something really nice actually happened where I was able to sit down and have a conversation with her, and it was totally rational, the entire thing, which I look at as being a massive, massive step forward because it's been about 10 years. And I was able to explain the God of the gaps to her without having her recoil in any way or have a stress response to it from what I could tell. So it's just, for me, it was a matter of realizing that if I wanted to still be friends with my mom, which I do, that I had to really just learn what the things were, because there's a little bit of a difference when you're dealing with family. They're so close, right? Your filters and your lenses are off in a sense. The triggers, you're not necessarily aware of them. The things that mom and dad and brother and sister, cousin do to get you riled up, you're not necessarily aware what those are. You have to sort of mind for that stuff, realize what it is, and then say, I'm just going to put that aside because it's more important to me they understand where I'm coming from. It's a lot of practice and thinking about it. But it's possible to, but it takes patience, consistent patience, and a lot of talking with other people afterward about it, I would say. Does that help?
Yes, that's it. Thank you.
This will be our last question then.
I apologize. I had a little bit of trouble following all of your presentation. You went a little fast in some places.
Sorry.
So I was wondering if you could go over it again a little bit more slowly. No, my question though is, do you have a particular method or approach to dealing with somebody who you suspect is going to react negatively to your atheistic beliefs?
Yes. I don't tell them I'm an atheist first. I tell them I'm an atheist last. Right? Because I want their first impression of me to be as just some person they relate to. And later on, I want them to find out, after their first impression has been a good one, and one that makes me seem like a good volunteer, a rational person, somebody who is out there being a good citizen in the community, I want that to be their first impression, and the conflicting information, the likely conflicting information of me being atheist, to be the last thing they hear. So that I've weighted their impression as being more realistic, actually, of who I really am. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Thanks.
Do you have a transcript of your speech that you just gave?
Sure. Yeah, I'll give you my card. You can email me and I'll send
Okay,
it.
thank you.
Sure. Thank you guys very much.